La 9138e séance du Conseil de sécurité est ouverte. L'ordre du jour provisoire de la présente séance est maintien de la paix et de la sécurité en Ukraine. L'ordre du jour est adopté. Conformément à l'article 37 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite le représentant de l'Ukraine à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Au nom du Conseil, je souhaite la bienvenue à son Excellence M. Volodymyr Zelensky, président de l'Ukraine. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Fédération de Russie qui a demandé à intervenir. Vous avez la parole.
Господин председатель, хотели бы вновь зафиксировать нашу позицию в связи с очередной попыткой наших западных коллег продавить участие в сегодняшнем заседании в виртуальном формате президента Украины Владимира Зеленского. Мы уже неоднократно подчеркивали, что вы не против самого по себе участия президента Украины или его представителя. Но это участие должно быть очным. Помимо того, что это требует правила, которые уже более 75 лет регулируют работу Совета Безопасности ООН, это еще и вопрос уважения к Совету. Он площадку для политических шоу или кинотеатров. Попустительство в этих вопросах наносит самый серьезный ущерб авторитету Совета. Именно такое шоу украинская делегация устроила в Генассамблее ООН на неделе высокого уровня, когда в зал срежиссированно нагонялась массовка, чтобы наглядно, чтобы аплодировать заранее записанному видео выступления украинского президента. А потом это снималось на телефоны и затем выдавалось в соцсетях за его якобы широкую поддержку среди членов Генассамблеи. Коллеги, не надо думать, что этого никто не заметил. Многие делегации выражали недоумение, когда эти группы якобы сторонников под руководством западных делегатов заходили и также централизованно выходили, выполнив свою роль. Жаль, что подобными неуклюжими, примитивными пиар-приемами девальвируется роль Совета Безопасности и ООН в целом, призванных быть площадками для серьезного диалога, а не для политических пиар-шоу. Это лишний раз иллюстрирует истинное отношение западных делегаций к ООН. Вас совершенно не заботит ни сохранность ее основ, ни ее авторитет, ни ее восприятие в глазах международного сообщества. В русофобском угаре вы готовы всем этим пожертвовать. Хочу также вновь подчеркнуть, что мы выступаем за суверенное равенство государств и категорически против двойных стандартов, когда среди членов ООН практикуют дискриминацию. Во многих из стран-членов ООН сложная внутриполитическая обстановка, однако их руководству не делается никаких послаблений. Точно так же и львиная доля международной гуманитарной помощи ориентирована именно на Украину, а про помощь нуждающимся в других частях света западные спонсоры словно забыли, тратя при этом миллиарды долларов на новые поставки оружия Киеву. Отсюда и двойные стандарты Европы в отношении мигрантов, когда беженцам из Украины на всех европейских границах дают зеленый свет, от беженцев из Африки, Ближнего Востока и других регионов отгораживаются. Призываем все страны-члены ООН занять принципиальную позицию по этому вопросу. Благодарю вас.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie pour sa déclaration. Conformément à l'article 39 du règlement intérieur provisoire du Conseil, j'invite également Mme Rosemary DiCarlo, secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires politiques et à la consolidation de la paix, à participer à la présente séance. Il en est ainsi décidé. Le Conseil de sécurité va maintenant aborder l'examen du point 2 de l'ordre du jour. Je donne à présent la parole à Madame DiCarlo.
Mr. President, the exceptional level of attention to the war in Ukraine reflects the widespread global concern about its dangerous and far-reaching consequences. This concern can only deepen, as the most recent developments in the war are ominous, pointing to more death, destruction, and suffering. Indeed, since the last council meeting on Ukraine on 22 September, we have seen actions that threaten to further escalate the conflict. As we meet, so-called referenda were just conducted by de facto authorities in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. Ukrainians were asked whether they approved their regions joining the Russian Federation. Voting took place in polling centers. De facto authorities, accompanied by soldiers, also went door to door with ballot boxes. These exercises, which began on 23 September, have been held during active armed conflict in areas under Russian control and outside Ukraine's legal and constitutional framework. They cannot be called a genuine expression of the popular will. Unilateral actions aim to provide a veneer of legitimacy to the attempted acquisition by force by one state of another state's territory, while claiming to represent the will of the people, cannot be regarded as legal under international law. Let me reiterate here that the United Nations remains fully committed to the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, in accordance with relevant UN resolutions. I'd like to recall that, as the occupying power, the Russian Federation is obliged under international humanitarian law to respect the laws of Ukraine in the administration of occupied territories. Mr. President, the past few weeks have also seen heavy fighting in southern Ukraine in the direction of Kherson and Zaporizhia, as well as escalating military operations in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In mid-September, the Ukrainian military undertook a successful counteroffensive to restore Ukrainian control over most of the Russian-held areas in Kharkiv region. We have continued to see not only daily attacks on many Ukrainian cities, including in Donetsk and Luhansk, but also the targeting of civilian energy and water infrastructure, reportedly by Russian forces. Recent reports of drone attacks in and around Odessa are also deeply disturbing. To date, OHCHR has recorded 14,844 civilian casualties, with 5,996 persons killed and 8,848 injured. This is 278 more civilians killed and 649 more injured since I last briefed this Council on 7 September. These are verified individual incidents. Actual figures are likely considerably higher. We've also heard alarming rhetoric regarding the use of nuclear weapons. This is unacceptable. Such rhetoric is inconsistent with the joint statement of the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms races, made on 3 January 2022. Let me reiterate the Secretary General's appeal for all nuclear-armed states, including the Russian Federation, to recommit to the non-use and progressive elimination of nuclear weapons. Mr. President, amid these grim developments, the United Nations continues to work to alleviate the suffering caused by the war, to support accountability for violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, and to prevent the deterioration of the already volatile situation around Ukraine's nuclear sites. UN and partner organizations need safe and unimpeded access to deliver life-saving assistance to all in need. In the areas of Kharkiv region back under Ukrainian control, they were able to organize several aid convoys. However, in areas outside government control in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Zaporizhia regions, access is the biggest challenge. Mr. President, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to report on violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. We are gravely concerned by allegations of violations committed in parts of northeastern Ukraine, including after the recovery of over 400 bodies from improvised graves in Izium. OHCHR is working with local authorities to investigate this, and other allegations of human rights violations and abuses in areas in Kharkiv region that were until recently under Russian control. There are other extremely disturbing reports. Following investigations in the areas of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and Sumy, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, mandated by the UN Human Rights Council, has concluded that war crimes were committed in Ukraine. Among other findings, the Commission was struck by the large number of executions and other violations carried out by Russian forces. In the 4 areas it covered, the Commission has processed 2 incidents of ill treatment against Russian Federation soldiers by Ukrainian forces. Rarely, if ever, has the international community collected so much evidence of human rights violations, potential war crimes, and other atrocities as they were happening. It is tragic that we have not been able to stop them, but it would be shameful if we were not able to ensure justice for the victims and their loved ones. Those responsible for the outrages being committed in Ukraine, wherever they sit, must be brought to account. Mr. President, we remain deeply troubled by reports of continuing attacks as recently as last week in the vicinity of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The UN continues to support the efforts of the International Atomic Energy Agency. We urge all concerned to provide maximum cooperation with IAEA. It is imperative that all attacks on nuclear facilities end and that the purely civilian nature of such plants be reestablished. Mr. President, by now, the global implications of this war on food and energy security felt by millions of people are well known. During the general debate, many member states decried this predicament. The Black Sea Grain Initiative continues to gather pace with more than 4.5 million metric tons of foodstuff shipped from Ukrainian ports, including to the Horn of Africa, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Efforts to remove remaining obstacles to the export of Russian food products and fertilizers also continue. These products are not under sanctions, and it is crucial to get them back to world markets. Averting a global food crisis makes it vital to renew the Black Sea grain deal when it expires at the end of November. Mr. President, in his remarks to the General Assembly, the Secretary General warned that the UN Charter and its ideals are in jeopardy and that we have a duty to act. I repeat his appeal to all member states to help prevent further escalation and to do all we can to end the war and ensure lasting peace in accordance with the principles of the Charter and international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Madame Di Carlo de son exposé et je vais à présent donner la parole à son Excellence Monsieur Volodymyr Zelensky, président de l'Ukraine. Vous avez la parole, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the UN Security Council who respect and fulfill the UN Charter, dear representatives of states and leaders who are listening to me now, the UN Security Council is the institution that works according to well-known and well-defined rules. This regulation, which is still being followed even by the representatives of Russia. So far, they haven't been using weapons instead of words in this room. They're not knocking out a chair from their neighbors in the Security Council. But surely no one will be surprised if this room of the UN Security Council will be turned into a zone of violence by representatives of Russia. Russia already despises the UN Charter. Russia is already breaking any rules of this war, of this world. So it's only a matter of time before it destroys the last international institution which can still function. That is why it is now that I'm calling upon you for actions. Anyone in the world can now give hundreds of examples as how Russia violates the international legal order and destroys the main body of international law. It constantly provokes escalation and constantly responds to any proposals for talks with a new brutality on the battlefield, with even greater crises and threats to Ukraine and the world. These are obvious things. I will name only 5. Only what is already happening right now. First, Russia has ignored the IAEA call for the immediate deoccupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and the termination of any hostile actions against any nuclear facilities of Ukraine. This fact, it's additional proof that Russia is deliberately keeping the world on the brink of radiation disaster. The second is a nuclear blackmail. The threats of using nuclear weapons have become a constant narrative of Russian officials and propagandists. This proves that Russia has no right to possess nuclear weapons, as it is unable to guarantee the safety of the world, even against the threats of using nuclear weapons. Third, last week, I've presented the UN General Assembly the Ukrainian peace formula. Russia's response to this real path to peace was the announcement of mobilization. Besides, Russia deliberately focuses its mobilization on the indigenous people from the territories it controls. These are not only the Caucasus or Siberia, where everything is being done to mobilize as many male as possible from indigenous population. But it's also about Crimea, the Ukrainian Crimea, which Russia has seized back in 2014. Among all the ethnic groups of Crimea, the male indigenous people of Crimean territories received the most of Russian draft notices. That's in proportion to the total number. This is a genocidal policy, frankly speaking. The fourth point, in front of the eyes of the whole world, Russia is conducting this so-called sham referenda on the occupied territory of Ukraine. People are forced to fill out some papers while being threatened by submachine guns, all for a nice TV cover. These alleged results of the sham referenda have been prepared well in advance, just as this compulsory issue of passports for the population of the occupied territories. Now, what's the reason for that? And the answer is in the next point, the fifth one, the annexation of the captured territories. This is the most brutal violation of the UN Charter. This is an attempt to steal the territory of another state. This is an attempt to erase the norms of international law. And this is a very cynical attempt to force the male population in the occupied territory of Ukraine to mobilize into the Russian army in order to send them to fight against their own homeland. There is only one way to stop this all. First, it's a complete isolation of Russia in response to everything it does. A state cannot remain a permanent member to the UN Security Council with the right of veto if such a state is waging a genocidal policy right now, skipping the world one step away from a radiation disaster. And at the same time, it keep on threatening with nuclear strikes. Russia should be excluded from all international organizations. If such an exclusion is procedurally complicated, then its participation should be suspended. Second, there is a need for new and tough global sanctions against Russia. Any annexation in the modern world is a crime against all states that consider the inviolability of borders to be vital for themselves. Third, any Russian criminal actions do not change anything for us. We do not succumb to the blackmail of terrorists. It is in Ukraine and in this war that not only our independence is being defended, not only the right to life for our people, but also the international law as such. Ukraine must receive all the necessary defense and financial support so the aggressor would lose. Fourth, Ukraine should receive clear and legally binding guarantees of collective security. Since the independence of our country is of such a fundamental importance for many elements of global security. The world also needs a respective security architecture. And fifth, that's very important. I want everyone to understand this. Russia's recognition of these sham referendums as normal, the implementation of the so-called Crimean scenario and another attempt to annex Ukrainian territory will mean that there is nothing to talk about with this president of Russia. Annexation is the kind of move that puts him alone against the whole of humanity. Such a clear signal is now needed from every country in the world. I believe in your ability to act. I thank to the French presidency for the opportunity to participate in this meeting. Thank you all for your attention. Glory to Ukraine.
Je remercie son Excellence, M. Zelensky, de sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole aux membres du Conseil de sécurité qui souhaitent faire une déclaration et je donne la parole à la représentante des États-Unis.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you to Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for your briefing today. Thank you, President Zelensky, for your statement. Colleagues, a little more than 7 months ago, just 7 months, we met at night in this chamber to discuss how we could preserve peace in Ukraine. At that moment, Putin chose war instead. The timing could not be clearer. Putin was showing exactly what he thought of this council. Last week, leaders from more than 100 countries from around the world gathered in New York to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter and many of the key principles it stands for: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peace and security. Instead of attending high-level week, Putin announced a renewed conscription effort in Russia and instructed areas under Russia's military control to prepare for illegitimate snap referenda. He did send an emissary who threatened the use of nuclear weapons on a non-nuclear country to secure Russia's illegitimate military gains. The purpose of all of this is clear. Russia intends to try to annex these territories, and Russia does not respect this body. The pattern is clear too. Putin intentionally chose this moment to insult the charter that outlines principles we all collectively stand for: sovereignty, territorial integrity, peace, and security. And he did this during the most important week for the United Nations, high-level week. Putin intends to commit an act which the UN Charter was expressly designed to prevent: an attempt by one UN member state to take the territory of another by force. We know this will happen because it follows a well-worn Kremlin playbook. Russia runs sham referendum in areas controlled by Russia's military and its proxies, coercing people to vote at gunpoint. It then uses these referenda to try to lend a semblance of legitimacy to its attempted annexations of another sovereign state's territory. The rush for Russia to institute and complete these attempted annexations destroy even the facade of legitimacy. As Ukraine successfully regains control over more of its territory that was wrongfully seized by Russia and more of Russia's atrocities are uncovered, Russia is rushing to draw a veil over its military losses and the war crimes it has committed. We know the outcomes of these sham referenda were predetermined in Moscow. They in no way represent a legitimate expression of the will of the Ukrainian people. The will of the Ukrainian people is clear every day as they fight valiantly for their country, as they protect their territorial integrity, as they defend their sovereignty. The Ukrainian people have already demonstrated they will never accept being subjugated to Russian rule. This Council and the international community must do the same. So now let me be clear. The United States will never recognize any territory Russia attempts to seize or allegedly annex as anything other than part of Ukraine. We reject Russia's actions unequivocally, and we will continue to work with our allies, partners, and like-minded to impose cost on Russia and to provide historic amounts of support for Ukraine. Justice demands nothing less. Protecting the UN Charter demands nothing less. In our many meetings here in the Security Council, we've heard repeated calls for the UN Charter to be respected. But it is not enough to call for respect of the UN Charter. We must have the courage to defend it. That means standing up for Ukraine and the victims of Russian atrocities. It means having the courage to call out aggression and attempts at naked territorial expansion when we see it. It means showing we care about peace by demanding Russia honor the UN Charter. Not doing so only enables Russia to commit further abuses. Russia started this war, and I hope that every member of this council will do the right thing by standing up for international law and the UN Charter by calling on Russia to end it now. Ukraine's fight is not only a fight for survival, but a fight for democracy and the very principles that we all hold dear. That is why we will be tabling a resolution condemning these sham referenda, calling on member states not to recognize any altered status of Ukraine, and obligating Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Russia's sham referenda, if accepted, will open a Pandora's box that we cannot close. We ask you to join us in reaffirming our commitment to the UN Charter and meeting this challenge head on. If Russia chooses to shield itself from accountability here in the Council, we will then look to the UN General Assembly to send an unmistakable message to Moscow. The world must stand together and defend the Charter of the United Nations. Have courage and support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is about defending the UN Charter. This is about defending our collective rights, and this is about peace and security for us all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie la représentante des États-Unis pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Albanie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et je remercie également la sous-secrétaire générale Di Carlo pour ses informations toujours perspicaces et utiles. Colleagues, I would like to start by a quote which reads, "Don't believe those who try to frighten you with Russia and who scream that other regions will follow after Crimea. We do not want a partition of Ukraine. We do not need this." This is what the President of Russia said in 2014. Everyone can judge by themselves. I doubt, though, this comes as a surprise to anyone, since for 9 months now, what we have heard from the Russian delegation here has little or nothing to do with what happens there on the ground. Two parallel realities. Now let's have a closer look of what will be known as the sham referendums being conducted these days by an extensive use of Kremlin's tricks. With the latest escalatory decisions and the partial mobilization, war has finally entered into the Russian households, and we have seen the reactions. Russians are resisting, they are protesting openly, and are massively leaving their country to escape drafting because they do not know why they should die in a war they do not want and they do not understand. In the city of Kherson, election officials went door to door with riot police. It is a well-known fact. When you vote at gunpoint, the process is more expedite. The so-called voting has been recorded on park benches, in shops, even in the makeshift booths in the police stations. better known locally as the torture chambers, which were put to such good use. Elsewhere, doors have been broken down to facilitate the voting process. So much for the solemn moment of voting, so much for the OSCE rules and standards. Yet the result is in no doubt. The vote count, engineered in Moscow with an already scripted result, will reveal that residents would love to be ruled by the invading power, Russia. The haste with which these sham referendums are being held makes it unlikely that the spectacle will convince anyone, including Russians themselves, of their legitimacy. Nobody in the world will take seriously the result of people voting at gunpoint of a referendum in the ruins. Ladies and gentlemen, let's make it clear. The sham referendums in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson have nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with free will of Ukrainians, nothing to do with any international election standard. They are just a replay of the same old script applied in Georgia and Crimea. Now they translate a desperate effort to hide failure and a worthless attempt to legitimize conquest in the eyes of an incredulous and deeply troubled world. Russia is projecting panic instead of power, instilling fear instead of force. And why such a haste? Because Ukraine's army is astonishingly pushing Russia out. Russians were told that everything is going to plan. It never did. Russia knows that it's losing big. Therefore, what I have qualified before here as the Russian referendum assembly line was quickly put into action. We don't want more of Ukraine, said President Putin in 2014, and suddenly the appetite of Kremlin has grown. 4 fresh territories are on the menu, comprising no less than 18% of the Ukraine territory. Mr. President, international law prohibits the occupier to change borders. Russia may claim that it has nothing to do with these plans since they are held and organized by the residents of the regions. But reality now and in the recent past has shown clearly that this is not true. By mid-March, Russian occupation authorities in Kherson and Zaporizhia appointed administrative leaders. According to the Ukrainian law, heads of local state administrations are proposed by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine and appointed by the president, not by Russian proxies. The sham referendums are against the constitution of Ukraine. A referendum can be called by the president or parliament or by a public initiative involving the valid signatures of at least 3 million registered voters, with at least 100,000 such signatures coming from every oblast. Furthermore, currently a martial law in force in Ukraine prohibits holding of any kind of elections or referendums. And finally, we have our own documents. According to UNGA Resolution 3314, annexation by the use of force of the territory of another state is in itself an act of aggression. The sham referendums run against the UN Charter, against UN resolutions, against international law, and are making a mockery of the principles that Russia has pledged to uphold as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, including when it threatens with the use of weapons of mass destruction. Mr. President, as stated last week by Prime Minister Edi Rama at the UNGA, we strongly condemn Russia's ongoing war and these premeditated mock elections in Ukraine. They have zero legality, zero legitimacy, zero credibility, and Albania will not recognize them. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, the excellence in monitoring elections, condemned what it qualified as illegal referenda. Also, attempts to compare these referendums with other cases out of every historic and political context are simply worthless cynicism. We call on all UN members, everyone for whom the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and inviolability of borders have a meaning, to oppose Russia's actions, condemn the referendums and their anticipated results, and never recognize any attempt to steal Ukraine land through violence and terror. Colleagues, while the war goes on, while Russia is hastily trying to change Ukraine's map, the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has concluded, based on evidence, that war crimes have been committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine. Last week, in this chamber, ICC Prosecutor General said that the bodies lying on the streets he saw in Bucha were real, not staged. Crimes committed in Ukraine are being meticulously documented. They will not be prescribed and will follow perpetrators until their last days. Also, we in the Security Council cannot stay idle. As we heard from the US delegation, together we have prepared a draft resolution to condemn the sham referendums, which has been shared with the Council members. Borders cannot change to satisfy Russia's appetite, and Ukraine is not and cannot be Russia. We must stay united and continue helping Ukraine defend itself and get its territory back. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Albanie pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Irlande.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I also want to thank USG DiCarlo for your briefing and President Zelensky for your statement. The President of Ukraine used the phrase sham referenda. Ireland fully agrees. We condemn these sham referenda being conducted in occupied Ukrainian territory by Russia or its proxies. No one who believes in and is fully committed to the principles enshrined in the UN Charter of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states could do otherwise. Why is this? Because these referenda, these sham referenda, are both illegal and illegitimate. They are illegal because they violate the UN Charter and Russia's obligations under international law, including the law of occupation. They also ignore Ukraine's constitution, which provides a legal basis for any referenda that would affect the territorial boundaries of Ukraine. And they are illegitimate because they do not reflect the popular or freely expressed will of the Ukrainian people. As we've previously heard in this chamber, over 1 million people from those occupied territories have been moved to Russia. This is as a result of Russia's military invasion, including by forced deportation. In fact, more than 7 million people are internally displaced within Ukraine because of this war. Mr. President, these referenda will never deter us from supporting the people of Ukraine. Might does not make right, nor will they have any legal or political effect on the status of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant or other Ukrainian nuclear facilities. These referenda are a cynical ploy to not only further undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also to try and reset an unjustified war. This is a blatant land grab to redefine areas of Ukraine as part of Russia. A blatant land grab. Mr. President, Ukraine has had a hard-won independence. It has had a hard-won path to establishing itself as a sovereign democracy free from foreign interference. It is sticking bravely to this choice, no matter what has been thrown at it. In particular, Ireland condemns Russia's nuclear threats and all nuclear threats, whether explicit or implicit, regardless of circumstance. Ireland once again calls on Russia to end its aggression immediately, to comply with its obligations under international law, and withdraw all forces unconditionally from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine, as much as the people elsewhere in the world, who are suffering the devastating impact of this war, deserve no less. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Irlande de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de l'Inde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will very briefly intervene. I thank Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her remarks. Mr. President, as stated by my minister in this very council at the last meeting on this subject, the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict is a matter of profound concern for the international community. India has repeatedly called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the need to resolve the ongoing conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. This was also stated unequivocally by Prime Minister Modi during his meeting with President Putin in the sidelines of the recent SCO summit in Tashkent. We firmly believe that the global order should be anchored on international law, the UN Charter, and respect for the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of states. India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be human-centric. On our part, we are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the global south under economic distress, even as they stare at the escalating costs of food, of fuel, and of fertilizers, which has been a consequential fallout of the ongoing conflict. Mr. President, the need of the hour is to end the conflict in Ukraine and return to the negotiating table. This has already resulted in the loss of countless lives and miseries for people, particularly for women, children, and the elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. Let us all work together to ensure that this comes to an early end. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de l'Inde de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin my statement by thanking USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. We join other speakers in expressing our deep concerns about the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine in violation of the fundamental principles of international law, especially relating to sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and the recognition of states. The invasion against Ukraine undermines, in our view, the purposes and principles of our Charter and stands in contrast to the norms which have guided recent interstate relations and given endurance to the international system. As confirmed by several heads of state and government during the just ended general debate of the General Assembly, the impact of the war has had palpable effects on the lives of millions of people across the world. It is their desire that this war and many such others be ended as soon as possible for peace to prevail. We therefore caution against heightening rhetoric and giving expression to contemplations that threaten the use of nuclear weapons, as that can only lead into the dark abyss of a nuclear catastrophe with no winners. We urge maximum restraint by all sides in what has so far been an effort at conventional warfare. Mr. President, Ghana is particularly concerned about the ongoing referendum in the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. We regret the attempts that are being made to disintegrate the legitimate authority of the government of Ukraine over its state territory. The process of the referendum, as we have heard, can least be described as free, fair, democratic, or reflective of the will of the people of Ukraine. We reiterate our principled position against the acquisition of territory through the threat or use of force. We cannot continue to live in parallel universes and accordingly urge the international community to use the full weight of its will to serve as a bulwark against such practices, which have a propensity to unravel the tenuous global stability that we presently have. We note with concern the unfortunate rise in humanitarian casualties as fighting continues in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. Unless an immediate ceasefire is reached, the escalation of military combat would result in further dire consequences for all. We therefore reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We also call on the parties to refrain from targeting civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law. We urge the Russian Federation, which has often attempted to situate its special operations within the ambit of international law, to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine and withdraw its troops from the internationally recognized borders of its neighbor. Mr. President, to safeguard international peace and security, we must urgently deepen diplomacy and widen international efforts to defuse the rising global tensions so as to facilitate a peaceful settlement of the conflict. The situation in Ukraine reinforces the imperative for a reformed and responsive council that is able to address all threats to international peace and security, including by all actors. Pending the much-needed reforms, we must continue to work together in finding pragmatic ways to address the challenges that confront our collective security. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Ghana pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Royaume-Uni.
Thank you, President. Let me thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo for her briefing. And I welcome the participation of President Zelensky in this meeting. Mr. President, Russia's holding of sham referenda in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions of Ukraine is an egregious violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and of the principles of the UN Charter. As the UN have told us today, this process is both illegal and illegitimate. It is a shameless propaganda effort aimed at justifying Russia's illegal presence on sovereign Ukrainian territory. We have seen Russia's referendum playbook before in Crimea. We see it playing out again now. Disinformation, intimidation, and fabrication. As my Foreign Secretary told the Council last week, we know that President Putin is planning to rig the outcome. These are regions that voted overwhelmingly to join an independent Ukraine in 1991 and to back President Zelensky in 2019. When given a free vote, their choice has been clear: to be part of a free, independent, democratic Ukraine. Since invading, Russia's control in these regions has been through violence, torture, filtration, and forced deportation. We've all seen images of soldiers with automatic rifles accompanying the ballots as they move from door to door, forcing Ukrainians to take part. Any referenda held under these conditions at the barrel of a gun can never be remotely close to free or fair. And the very idea that a referendum on a fundamental question could be held at 3 days' notice in the middle of a war zone is frankly farcical. We must all unequivocally reject these illegitimate actions and Russian attempts to illegally annex Ukrainian territory, and support the draft resolution the US and Albania have brought forward today. Colleagues, this is a critical moment. There is no middle ground. No member of the United Nations should turn a blind eye to Russia tearing up the principles of the UN Charter. If we allow Russia to believe it can change sovereign borders by force, then the entire system on which we base our shared safety and security is under threat. These Potemkin referenda, as well as Putin's decision to mobilize Russian men to fight in his illegal war, are admissions that his invasion is failing. Instead of sending thousands more of his own citizens to their death and inflicting further destruction on Ukraine, he should end this senseless war today. Thank you.
Du Royaume-Uni de sa déclaration, et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Brésil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary Di Carlo for her briefing. Brazil shares the concerns about the referenda in regions of Ukraine. In the current conditions, this is yet another step that leads to an escalation of the conflict. Far from expressing the will of the people of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, the referenda tend to make the prospect of peace negotiations even more distant. The UN Charter and the international covenants on civil and political rights and on economical, social, and cultural rights recognize the inalienable right of all peoples to self-determination and to freely decide their political status. This is a fundamental principle of international law, which is the very basis of the legitimacy of states. Many times before, especially in the context of decolonization, the holding of referenda was the means chosen for peoples to express their free will. Resolutions of this Council established the use of this instrument as a legitimate practice to decide on issues of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Its validity, however, depends on certain conditions, it is unreasonable to assume that populations in areas in conflict are able to freely express their will. International practice recommends that referenda on questions of sovereignty be conducted in a transparent manner, without restrictions on freedom of expression, and with the possibility of monitoring by independent observers. This does not seem to be the case for the aforementioned regions of Ukraine. Brazil stands by the principles of respecting territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. Mr. President, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire and the opening of peace negotiations. The Istanbul agreements in July and last week's prisoner exchanges were positive signs that demonstrate the value of diplomacy in reducing the human suffering resulting from this conflict. These advances, while extremely relevant, are insufficient. It is essential that the parties refrain from adopting measures that result in an escalation of hostilities, including in rhetorical terms. The moment calls for restraint and pragmatism. We believe that this Council is primarily a forum for negotiation and for dialogue. So far, we have collectively failed to find creative solutions to the conflict. Negotiation and dialogue, advocated by most members in their interventions over the past 7 months, presupposes a willingness to listen. Perhaps we should ask ourselves how sensitive we are to the concerns of others, especially to the lives of those on the ground, which should come before any political considerations. And I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Brésil de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Mexique.
Gracias, presidente. Agradezco a la subsecretaria Di Carlo por su presentación y al presidente Zelensky por sus comentarios en esta sesión. Seguimos con atención las informaciones que se refieren a las convocatorias para realizar referendos en las regiones de Donetsk, Luhansk, Gerson y Zaporizhia. La resolución 1514 de la Asamblea General es explícita al indicar que todo intento encaminado a quebrantar total o parcialmente la unidad nacional y la integridad territorial de un país es incompatible con los propósitos y principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. En consecuencia, exhortamos a todos los estados a abstenerse de emprender acciones que busquen quebrantar total o parcialmente la unidad nacional o que atenten contra la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania o de cualquier otro país. Reiteramos que de conformidad con el artículo 2.4 de la Carta de la ONU, cualquier intento de modificar fronteras mediante la amenaza o el uso de la fuerza o a través de cualquier otra forma que sea incompatible con los principios y propósitos de las Naciones Unidas es violatorio del derecho internacional. Refrendamos el derecho a la libre determinación de los pueblos, tal y como lo señala la resolución 2625 de la Asamblea General, la cual también señala que el goce y ejercicio de este derecho no puede ser entendido, cito, en el sentido de que autoriza o fomenta acción alguna encaminada a quebrantar o menoscabar total o parcialmente la integridad territorial de estados soberanos e independientes. Termina la cita. En suma, la posición de México se mantiene en línea con la resolución 68/262 de la Asamblea General y dada la gravedad del entorno en el que se han desarrollado los citados referendos, reiteramos nuestro llamado al diálogo urgente entre las partes, así como a fortalecer los canales diplomáticos para promover medidas que fomenten la confianza y, como lo señaló el secretario de Relaciones Exteriores de mi país la semana pasada en este Consejo, a abrir nuevos espacios para la mediación que puedan llevar a un cese de las hostilidades. Gracias.
Je remercie le représentant du Mexique pour sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Chine.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，中方注意到乌克兰局势的最新变化，也认真听取了有关各方就此发表的意见。我们看待和处理乌克兰问题的立场和主张是一贯的、明确的，就是各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。中国始终站在和平一边，一直致力于劝和促谈，将继续发挥建设性作用。主席先生，在刚刚结束的联大一般性辩论中，许多国家领导人都对乌克兰危机长期化、扩大化及其引发的外溢影响表示了担忧，呼吁通过对话谈判实现停火止战，管控危机的外溢造成的负面影响。近来发生的事态再次提醒我们，和平需要各方共同争取和维护，集团对抗、政治孤立、制裁施压，只会让问题解决走向死胡同。当务之急是要推动当事方尽快打开政治解决的大门，把各自合理关切都纳入谈判，把所有可行选项都摆上桌面。黑海粮食倡议的签署启发我们，即使在冲突局势下，外交努力一样可以取得成果，带来希望。坚持以国际法为基础的国际秩序，恪守以联合国宪章宗旨原则为基础的国际关系基本准则，不能停留在政治口号上。安理会作为集体安全机制的核心，应当充分用好宪章赋予的斡旋调节工具，遵循止战促谈的正确方向。尤其要采取建设性、负责任的行动，为政治解决积累条件、开辟空间。中方将同所有爱好和平的国家一道，继续为缓和局势、解决危机做出不懈的努力。谢谢主席先生。
Je remercie le représentant de la Chine de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President, and welcome back. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing on the dire situation in Ukraine. We again send our heartfelt condolences to all Ukrainians who are suffering the physical, psychological, and economic ravages of war. We are very concerned with the reports of referenda being held in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, and their impact on Ukraine's status as a member of the United Nations and on international peace and security. The UN Secretary General has stated clearly, and I quote him, "Any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the UN Charter and of international law. Close quote. This is the fundamental truth that should be heeded by the Russian Federation and all members of the United Nations. The referenda will undermine the prospects of a longer-term negotiated peace settlement. By attempting to create a fait accompli, they will encourage those who are increasingly put their faith in the strengthening of armed alliances in preparation for war. As if this were not sufficiently alarming, we have heard serious threats being made of the use of weapons of mass destruction. To pull back from the brink of disaster, Kenya calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a stop to all attempts to unilaterally alter internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, our frequent briefings, debates, and consultations on the situation in Ukraine are taking place as the economic and conflict situations in different parts of the world get worse. Unfortunately, the most powerful actors are focusing far more on this conflict in Europe than on any other crisis. There appears to be little appetite, and because of this war, even less unity to deliver the reforms and policies that we all know are needed. Mr. President, bold action is required to halt the extreme food insecurity and even starvation in the world. The World Food Programme has calculated that in Eastern Africa, just as an example, fertilizer prices have more than doubled in the last year, and especially so since the invasion of Ukraine. Fuel prices have also risen sharply. WFP calculates that the result will be a year-on-year decline of 16% in cereal production, representing 7.2 million metric tons. In an already food insecure region, the impact will be to increase the number of hungry people by almost 7 million. This situation is reflected in other regions. It is a matter of life and death for all actors to respond to the global food insecurity crisis. The Black Sea Grain Initiative and the agreement to ensure unimpeded exports of Russian food and fertilizer to world markets were a promising start. It is imperative that all institutions that are enforcing compliance with sanctions ensure that all unintended blockages are removed. There are sufficient reports of negative secondary effects on banking, insurance, transport, and other critical enabling mechanisms. We also urge major grain and fertilizer producers to avoid stockpiling and breaking delivery contracts. Ongoing plans to create emergency mechanisms in this regard may be at a serious detriment of global food security. We urge that any efforts to design and deploy emergency food and energy security mechanisms be accompanied by planning for transformed food systems in the most food insecure regions. A major part of this would be making the necessary investment in sharply increasing agricultural productivity, particularly in Africa. Doing so is key to preventing cycles of humanitarian crises and the declining donor-funded responses to the worst of them. It will also allow investing in climate change resilient food systems at a time when catastrophic effects are being experienced in multiple regions. Finally, greater production, increased storage, and sufficient transport infrastructure will lead to low food prices and therefore greater political stability. Mr. President, the multilateral system cannot continue as it is today. The major powers are so bent on protecting and projecting their interests and security concerns that they seem unable to act in the broader interests of our United Nations. Today, the inarguable truth is that the protections afforded by membership of this organization are insufficient. Rather than the Charter granting us equality, we are governed by the destructive logic encapsulated by the saying, and I quote, "The question of justice only enters where there is equal power to enforce it, and that the powerful exact what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." It is time we sought real changes in global institutions, including this Security Council. It is time for real inclusion and real fairness. We can start with procedural rules in the Council and eventually make changes to the Charter. The reforms should not be limited to allowing only other major powers a seat at the table. It is clear from the historical record that the voice and presence of developing countries with no major military interests to protect regionally or globally needs to be strengthened significantly. A multilateralism founded on the principle of the powerful exacting what they can while the weak suffer what they must is a poor protection against the scourge of war, as we are all witness today. Madam President, or Mr. President, sorry. Kenya reaffirms once more its recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Kenya de sa déclaration et je passe à présent la parole au représentant des Émirats arabes unis.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her updates. Having just concluded this year's high-level week of the General Assembly, a resounding message we heard from many world leaders remains at the forefront of our minds. The world wants peace in Ukraine. It seems, however, that we are moving further away from this common objective of peace and stability. The referendums that are now underway further complicate efforts for a peaceful resolution to this conflict. In order to be credible and sustainable, any processes that aim to bring us closer to peace must be inclusive, and any actions that undermine this prospects for constructive dialogue must be avoided by all parties. We re-emphasize the need to respect the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence, which are core to the UN Charter and central to constructive relations between states. These principles protect all states equally, whether large or small, and collectively, we must not allow their erosion. In pursuit of peace, this Council has an essential role in preserving these principles, prioritizing the peaceful settlement of disputes, and maintaining international peace and security. We recall here the January 2022 joint statement of the permanent members of this Council, affirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Over the past few months, we have seen incremental movement between the parties that has led to tangible, positive outcomes on concrete issues. We commend the United Nations and others that have facilitated constructive engagement in this regard. Most recently, the fruits of these efforts have included prisoner exchanges conducted with the assistance of Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and agreements related to the export of grains and fertilizer, which have helped to alleviate pressure on global food supplies and prices. There is further potential to build on these agreements. Moreover, the direct engagement that brought them to fruition can help diffuse tensions and open a pathway for conflict resolution. To this end, the parties must be supported in moving toward dialogue and away from further escalation. We once again underline the necessity of all parties abiding by their obligations under international law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the war has carried on for over 7 months with no sign of abating. During this time, nearly 14.5 million people were forced to flee their homes, with more than 7 million of them now displaced across Europe. Humanitarian costs have been immense, with more than 17 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. It is long past time for this conflict to come to an end. For that to happen, we continue to emphasize the importance of an immediate cessation of hostilities throughout Ukraine. Additionally, it is essential to build on and amplify positive developments between the parties so we can begin to pull back from this dangerous point of heightened global tensions. What we need now is to secure a peace that is sustainable and in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant des Émirats arabes unis de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de la Norvège.
Thank you, President. We thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. In the last day, we have all seen images of armed Russian soldiers going door to door in occupied parts of Ukraine to collect votes for a so-called referendum on joining Russia. This is a phony pretext from the aggressor, Russia, to try to annex more parts of Ukraine. And let me be clear, Ukraine has not authorized these referenda, and Norway rejects these Russian fabrication in occupied regions of Ukraine. Whatever outcome Russia announces, they remain contrary to international law, have no legal effects, and would in no way change Ukraine's sovereignty within its international recognized borders. President, we are also clear that no territorial acquisition resulting from use of force shall be recognized as lawful, and that no Russian claims to annex territory can take away Ukraine's right to defend its own land. All states, including Russia, have an obligation under Article 2 of the Charter of the United Nations to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, and to settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Russia's announcement of the mobilization of reserve forces is another issue of grave concern. It is a dangerous escalation which will lead to increased suffering for people in all parts of Ukraine. President, unspeakable horrors were relieved in Bucha, in Izium, and other places occupied by Russian forces. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded in the update given last Friday that war crimes have been committed in Ukraine by Russia. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas have been a source of immense harm and suffering, not distinguishing between civilians and combatants, adults or children. The Commission also found accounts of ill treatment and torture carried out during unlawful confinement, and that Russian soldiers have committed sexual and gender-based violence. The age of victims ranged from 4 to 82 years. The Commission has documented cases in which children have been raped, tortured, and unlawfully confined. Norway condemns these acts in the strongest terms and calls for accountability for the perpetrators. President, this war has had abhorrent impacts on the people of Ukraine and now is being felt across the globe. We must work urgently to bring it to an end. Norway expresses its full support for the Secretary General's good offices, and when the time comes, we will stand firmly with the UN's effort to build and sustain peace. The Ukrainian people are paying with their lives to defend universal values and their own independence. Ukraine can count on Norway's continued support. Russia must stop the war and fully, immediately, and unconditionally withdraw its forces and military equipment from all territory of Ukraine. And again, Norway will never recognize these so-called referenda, and we stand by Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de la Norvège de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je salue la participation à cette session du président Zelensky. Je remercie la sous-secrétaire générale Rosemary DiCarlo pour son exposé. Monsieur le Président, nous sommes préoccupés par les nombreux signaux qui laissent présager un durcissement de la guerre en Ukraine. Nous avons entendu pendant le débat général de l'Assemblée générale la plupart des dirigeants du monde appeler avec emphase à la négociation en vue de trouver une solution durable à la situation en Ukraine. Nous ne cesserons d'appeler à la désescalade. Les parties doivent s'abstenir de toute attitude de nature à jeter de l'huile sur le feu et privilégier les issues pouvant garantir une coexistence pacifique. La Charte des Nations unies, qui constitue le ciment de notre vivre ensemble, doit être la boussole de toutes les parties dans le respect de la souveraineté et de l'intégrité territoriale de chaque membre de la communauté internationale. Monsieur le Président, nous appelons les parties à tout mettre en œuvre pour une reprise sans condition des négociations en vue de mettre fin à la guerre. La situation humanitaire ne cesse de se dégrader et l'onde de choc de la guerre ne cesse de s'élargir, suscitant toujours plus de morts et de désolation. Mon pays exhorte les parties à cesser toute rhétorique outrancière de nature à envenimer la belligérance et à agiter le recours aux armes de destruction massive. Pour terminer, nous appelons une fois de plus les parties à faire taire les armes et à saisir chaque opportunité pour rechercher la paix. Nous soutenons les différentes initiatives, aussi bien bilatérales que multilatérales, visant un dialogue constructif et une paix durable entre les parties. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie la représentante du Gabon de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Fédération de Russie.
Господин председатель, в Донецкой и Луганской республиках, а также Херсонской и Запорожской областях состоялись референдумы о вхождении в состав Российской Федерации. В ближайшие дни будут подведены их официальные итоги. Это долгожданное событие для жителей Донбасса, которое должно принести на их земли мир, которого они не видели уже долгие 8 лет. Все эти 8 лет жители данных территорий живут в постоянном страхе за свою жизнь. Обстрелы Донецкой и Луганской Народной Республик все эти годы каждую неделю убивали по 10 человек, гибли дети. Жители же Херсонщины и Запорожья наконец-то смогут быть уверены в том, что никто не отберет у них право говорить по-русски и обучать на родном языке своих детей. А священный для всех День Победы они смогут отдать в День памяти тем, кто воевал с фашистами за освобождение своей земли, а не тем, кто с ними сотрудничал и совершал ужасающие преступления. С 2014 года Киев целенаправленно взял курс на физическое истребление неугодных жителей Луганской и Донецкой народных республик, между прочим, граждан Украины, при покровительстве Евросоюза и США. Они палец о палец не ударили, чтобы заставить киевские власти соблюдать Минские соглашения, гарантировавшие безопасность граждан этих республик и их достойное будущее в составе Украины. Я напомню, Минские соглашения предусматривали прекращение огня, прямой диалог Киева и Донбасса, предоставление ему особого статуса через принятие новой Конституции. Все эти договоренности киевские власти цинично попрали, нарушив в том числе резолюцию Совета Безопасности 2202. И западные делегации не только этому не возмутились, они это тайно и явно поддерживали. Если бы не это преступное попустительство и лицемерие, если бы Запад принудил своих подопечных в Киеве соблюдать элементарные права человека, уважать своих же сограждан, прежде всего их право на жизнь, никакая спецоперация с нашей стороны не потребовалась бы. Власти Украины открыто объявили русских и русскоязычных граждан этих регионов нелюдями, особами. Владимир Зеленский в одном из интервью в августе прошлого года заявил, что всем, кто считает себя русским и любит русский язык, ради своего блага и блага своих детей, стоит убраться из Украины в Россию. Теперь жители Донбасса, Херсонской и Запорожской областей выполняют его циничную рекомендацию, возвращаясь на родину и забираясь при этом с собой земли, на которых столетиями жили их предки. Разумеется, сыграло роль и то, что нам удалось спасти от трагичного сценария, развернувшегося на Донбассе, население Крыма, сделавшее в 2014 году выбор в пользу возвращения в состав России. Тогда мы слышали все те же обвинения в агрессии и аннексии. Но за эти 8 лет жизнь в Крыму изменилась в лучшую сторону, люди живут без страха за свои жизни, активно развивается экономика, строится инфраструктура. Мы все эти годы искренне вкладывались в развитие этого региона и точно так же будем развивать Донбасс и другие территории, которые Киев стремился и продолжает стремиться превратить в руины. Зная, что наши бывшие западные партнеры нас не услышат, точнее сделают вид, что не услышали. Однако скажу, что референдумы были проведены в условиях исключительной прозрачности при полном соблюдении всех избирательных норм. Это непреложный факт, сколько бы киевский режим и его покровители не пытались утверждать обратное. За их ходом наблюдали более 100 независимых международных наблюдателей из 40 стран. Они активно делятся своими впечатлениями в СМИ и в соцсетях, в том числе о том, что были удивлены тем, с каким энтузиазмом жители Донецкой и Луганской народных республик, Херсонской и Запорожской областей отнеслись к этим референдумам. Как долго они этого ждали. К сожалению, вы не услышите их оценки в эфирах западных СМИ, равно как и не увидите кадров с интервью с жителями этих регионов. Западные страны изначально заявили, что не будут признавать результаты этих референдумов и бросили всю мощь своей пропагандистской машины на их очернение. Нас нисколько не удивляют пропагандистские вбросы о том, что людей якобы принуждают к голосованию, что их по несколько дней пытали, чтобы заставить сделать выбор в пользу присоединения к России. Или, как заявила Минотдел Германии Анна-Лена Бербок, цитирую, «их расстреливают и насилуют, а потом они должны ставить галочки, пока рядом с ними стоят солдаты с автоматами Калашникова в руках». Конец цитаты. То есть, видимо, они голосуют уже после того, как их расстреляли и изнасиловали. А те солдаты, которые вы видели по телевизору, охраняли участников референдума от весьма вероятных провокаций со стороны Украины. Помимо пропагандистской машины, вооруженные силы Украины бросили всю мощь своей, а точнее западной военной машины, интенсифицировав артиллерийские обстрелы городов, где проходили референдумы, чтобы посеять панику среди граждан в безнадежной попытке сорвать голосование. Истерика, раздуваемая западными делегациями, в том числе и сегодня в Совете Безопасности, свидетельствует о том, что прямое волеизъявление граждан давно перестало быть критерием демократического выбора. Признание таковым является только лишь, если это одобрено на Западе. В целом, западная версия демократии выродилась в диктат либерального меньшинства над консервативным большинством. Причем эта форма отрицания права на нелиберальное и нерусофобское инакомыслие применяется не только к Украине, но и в отношении своих же союзников по Западному блоку. Не далее, чем позавчера, глава Еврокомиссии Урсула фон дер Ляйен по сути открыто угрожала Италии последствиями в случае, если исход на выборах в этой стране не понравится Брюсселю. В черном списке Венгрия, а из кандидатов на вступление больше всего достается Сербии, которую, несмотря на исторические симпатии к России, пытаются заставить занять антироссийскую позицию и поддержать губительные для экономики санкции против нашей страны. А вот свежий пример. Посол США в Белграде вчера потребовал от Сербии объяснений в связи с подписанием на полях Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН плана консультаций между МИД Сербии и Россией. Ну, что это, если это не форма неоколониального диктата? Уважаемые коллеги, отказывая жителям Донбасса и освобожденных территорий Украины в праве на самоопределение, западные делегации демонстрируют вопиющие двойные стандарты. Самые громкие критики референдумов в Донбассе, Запорожской и Херсонской областях в свое время были в первых рядах сторонников независимости Косово. И тогда они утверждали, что у этой территории есть право на выход из состава сербского государства в случае реальной угрозы того, что права косово-албанцев будут серьезным образом нарушены. Так называемое отделение в целях защиты. Подчеркну, что это были не просто заявления, а официальная юридическая позиция, представленная западными странами в Международном суде ООН в 2008 году. При этом в тот момент косовским албанцам ничего уже давно не угрожало. Югославии уже не было на карте, а в разбомбленной НАТО Сербии в качестве миротворцев находился иностранный контингент. Хочу подчеркнуть, в отличие от Крыма, Луганской и Донецкой народных республик, Херсонщины и Запорожья, в Косово вообще не проводилось никаких референдумов. Не было никакого свободного волеизъявления населения. только Декларация независимости, принятая Временным органом самоуправления с превышением его полномочий. Но тогда Западу этого было достаточно, чтобы признать независимость Косово. И он утверждал, что международное право не запрещает провозглашать независимость. Сегодня же мы слышим кардинально иную позицию от западной делегации. Это очередное проявление их циничных двойных стандартов. Уважаемые коллеги из развивающихся стран, не дайте ввести себя в заблуждение. Хотя западные делегации сегодня на камеру сокрушаются о якобы имевшем место нарушение международного права и принципов Устава ООН, на самом деле оно совершенно не заботит. Когда это отвечает их геополитическим интересам, как в случае с Косово. Помогает реализовывать на Балканах собственные устремления, мешая народам идти суверенным путем развития. Западные страны целиком поддерживают право на самоопределение. Когда же речь заходит о самоопределении как единственном возможном способе спасти от геноцида жителей Донбасса, они заявляют, что такого права у них нет. В уставе ООН содержится принцип уважения территориальной целостности. Однако такое уважение в соответствии с международным правом не является безусловным. Как известно, Генассамблея коллегиально на консенсусной основе дала принципу территориальной целостности толкование в Декларации о принципах отношений между государствами в соответствии с Уставом ООН. Оно заключается в следующем. Все государства обязаны уважать суверенитет и территориальную целостность любых государств, чьи правительства уважают принцип самоопределения народов и представляют все народы, живущие на их территории. Об этом важнейшем критерии наши западные коллеги сегодня предпочитают не вспоминать. Ведь после государственного переворота 2014 года, после запрета русского языка, образования, СМИ, после того, как майданные власти долгие годы бомбили территорию, население которой отказалось признать результаты госпереворота, после сожженных заживо русских активистов в Одессе, после того, как в Киеве утвердился режим, поставивший украинскую нацию превыше всего и возвеличивавший фашистских коллаборантов и их наследие, кто-то посмеет сказать, что власти в Киеве представляют интересы населения Донбасса, да и в целом русскоязычного населения, которое они всеми силами стремятся украинизировать или истребить. При этом очевидно, что государством, в полной мере уважающим все проживающие у себя народы и исторические и этнические группы, не стоит опасаться за свою территориальную целостность. Наши соседи по Европе, за исключением безнадежно больных русофобией прибалтийских государств, прекрасно об этом знают и не поступают, как киевский режим у себя дома. Бельгия, Швейцария, Финляндия – наиболее яркие примеры терпимости к множественности культуры и языков. То же самое относится и к подавляющему большинству азиатских и африканских государств с пестрым этническим составом. И только Украина, где русскоязычное население составляет как минимум 40% населения, получила от Запада карт-бланш на его насильственную украинизацию, вопреки любым цивилизованным нормам и рекомендациям международных организаций. Так почему теперь на Западе удивляются, что на Украине встречают российские войска как освободители, как бы не пытался давно уже держащийся на натовских штыках киевский режим утверждать обратное, угрожая жителям этих регионов карами за коллаборационизм? Кстати сказать, власть в Киеве не гнушается иногда использовать русский язык из тактических и пропагандистских соображений. Достаточно упомянуть, что президент Зеленский не постеснялся за последние дни записать несколько видеообращений по-русски, чтобы попытаться сорвать недавно объявленную в России частичную мобилизацию, по майданным рецептам вбить клин между властью и обществом. Вот и сегодня президент Зеленский с экрана утверждал, что в ходе мобилизации призываются прежде всего граждане нерусских национальностей, как можно больше мужчин, представляющих коренное население регионов России. В России этот обман не пройдет. Западные пропагандисты плохо себе представляют менталитет российского народа. Наши люди прекрасно знают, где правда и где ложь, и за что они сражаются. Как на протяжении столетий сражались их деды и прадеды, каждый раз, когда внешний недруг пытался максимально ослабить российское государство. Мы раз за разом в кровопролитных битвах в разные исторические периоды отстаивали право на нашу свободу и право идти своим путем. Наш народ помнит историю, помнит, как тяжело это давалось. Но мы, так же, как и десятилетия и столетия назад, готовы отстаивать интересы нашего Отечества и защищать слабых. Это в наших генах, и никакая западная пропаганда, никакие изощренные политтехнологии этого не изменят. Все прекрасно понимают, что единственная цель Запада, с которым мы схлестнулись у самых наших границ, максимально ослабить и обескровить Россию, а в мечтах его стратегов расчленить ее и подчинить своей воле. Уважаемые коллеги, желания и интересы Украины западными спонсорами Киева абсолютно не принимают своего внимания. Ведь украинский народ, так же как и российский, хочет мира, но такой сценарий не входит в планы Лондона и Вашингтона, зарабатывающие, как всегда, миллиарды долларов на чужой беде и поддакивающих брюссельских функционеров. Иначе они не одернули бы Киев в марте этого года, когда мирное соглашение было уже в пределах досягаемости. Вместо этого состоялась вопиющая провокация в Буче и установка сражаться до последнего украинца под надзором натовских наемников и инструкторов. Итог этого сценария, как мы и предрекали, оказался плачевным. Сегодня от Киева отвернулось население не только Крыма и Донбасса, но и Херсонской и Запорожской областей. И этот процесс неизбежно пойдет дальше, если в Киеве не осознают своих ошибок и стратегических просчетов, и не начнут, наконец, руководствоваться интересами своих граждан, а не слепо исполнять волю тех, кто довольно потирает руки от того, что столкнул лбами два братских народа. Хочется верить, что среди наших коллег по Совету Безопасности и Генассамблеи ООН найдутся те, кто сможет доходчиво подсказать Киеву эту очевидную истину. Благодарю вас.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie pour sa déclaration. Je vais à présent faire une déclaration en ma qualité de représentant de la France. Je remercie Madame Di Carlo pour sa présentation. Depuis 7 mois, nous appelons la Russie à mettre fin à sa guerre d'agression contre l'Ukraine. En dépit de nos appels, elle a choisi l'escalade et décidé d'aller encore plus loin dans la violation de la Charte des Nations Unies et du droit international. En annonçant le 21 septembre une mobilisation partielle de sa population, la Russie admet enfin une réalité. Elle mène une guerre illégale en Ukraine et non pas une prétendue opération spéciale. Elle poursuit sa fuite en avant en organisant depuis le 23 septembre des simulacres de référendum dans les territoires actuellement occupés de Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv et Zaporijia, qui font partie intégrante du territoire ukrainien et que la Russie ne contrôle d'ailleurs pas entièrement. Le président Macron l'a dit très clairement, ces prétendus référendums ne sont qu'une parodie, ils n'ont aucun fondement juridique ni aucune légitimité. Soyons clairs, le résultat, connu d'avance, n'exprime pas la volonté du peuple ukrainien qui continue à résister de manière acharnée contre l'envahisseur. La manœuvre de la Russie est bien connue, c'est la même que celle utilisée pour l'annexion illégale de la Crimée en 2014. Elle entend instrumentaliser ces simulacres de référendum pour prétendre légitimer une annexion des territoires qu'elle occupe illégalement. Le secrétaire général l'a rappelé, toute annexion du territoire d'un État par un autre État, par la menace ou le recours à la force, constitue une violation de la Charte des Nations Unies et du droit international. La France ne reconnaîtra jamais ces tentatives d'annexion illégale par la Russie. Il est impératif que chaque membre des Nations Unies rejette sans équivoque cette mascarade. Si nous laissons la Russie modifier par la force les frontières internationalement reconnues de l'Ukraine, nous la laissons une fois de plus piétiner les principes de souveraineté et d'intégrité territoriale ancrés dans la Charte des Nations Unies et le droit international. Le sort des territoires occupés en Ukraine nous concerne tous. Quel pays pourra s'estimer à l'abri si nous laissons la Russie faire aujourd'hui? Ces simulacres de référendum sont un nouveau mensonge destiné à travestir la réalité. Comme l'a rappelé la ministre Catherine Colonna la semaine dernière dans cette même salle, La réalité, c'est que la Russie poursuit cette guerre qu'elle a provoquée, qu'elle entretient et qu'elle aggrave chaque jour davantage. La réalité, c'est que l'Ukraine exerce son droit de légitime défense et qu'elle se bat pour défendre son territoire. La réalité, c'est que la contre-offensive de l'armée ukrainienne porte ses fruits grâce au courage de son peuple. La réalité, ce sont ces dizaines de milliers de citoyens russes qui fuient actuellement leur pays pour échapper à la mobilisation et à une guerre inique. La France continuera de fournir à l'Ukraine, aussi longtemps que nécessaire, le soutien dont elle a besoin pour faire respecter son indépendance, sa souveraineté et son intégrité territoriale. Nous nous tenons aux côtés de l'Ukraine et de son peuple. Je reprends mes fonctions de président du Conseil de sécurité. Le représentant de l'Albanie a demandé la parole pour intervenir à nouveau de manière très brève.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I hate asking for the floor one second time since it gives me the impression I was not clear enough. But in this case, I need to. This is not to prolong the discussion, of course, everything is clear, but to put the record straight. The Russian delegation made, again, a parallel with the Republic of Kosovo, an independent country that has been recognized by half of the United Nations, including half of this Council. This is wrong, inaccurate, and regrettable. I have already reacted to similar remarks on this last June, therefore I'll be very short. Nothing could be more artificial and forced than comparing an international effort to end the conflict, protect civilians, and establish a peace process to finding a lasting solution, which was the case of Kosovo, with a pure and unprovoked aggression and the sham referendums engineered in Moscow that are being carried out now in Ukraine. No one is, can, or will be fooled by this. No attempts to compare the incomparable, no easy shortcuts out of any historic and political context will help Russia divert attention from its war of choice in Ukraine or hide its blatant breach of international law, which has made it an international para. Kosovo and Serbia are bound today by a dialogue to solve their problems. They meet, they do not fight. And above all, the issue is not Kosovo or any part of the world. It's Russia's aggression, Russia's crimes, Russia's territory grab to the detriment of its neighbor. We will not be misled. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Albanie de sa déclaration et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Fédération de Russie qui a demandé la parole.
Господин председатель, я буду очень краток. Я хочу просто обратить внимание, что то, что сейчас мы услышали от представителя Албании, это как раз подтверждает те двойные стандарты, о которых я говорил в отношении Косово, приводя его в пример тому, как поступили с Косово наши западные коллеги, которые сегодня призывают нас поступить совершенно иным образом в отношении референдума, который проводится на территории областей, о которых мы сегодня говорили.
Je remercie le représentant de la Fédération de Russie de sa déclaration. Il n'y a plus d'autres oratrices ou orateurs inscrits sur la liste. La séance est levée.
sting. But I think if you get it one, then you should be fine because of the boosters. The other thing is they give you the strokes that you take. No, they give it to young people. I think anyone over 40, they give this, whatever it's called. And that's like one of the first. Oh, I fed up the whole thing. As long as you're not getting it. We always get that. Yes, we didn't need this.
Yeah, I was going to say they're expecting the use of that
Oh yeah? Didn't know that. I've got something in my office. Yes, okay, I'll come back. I'll be back as soon as this is finished. It's not that exciting. I'll tell you afterwards.
Can you step back just a bit?
Of course. Hello.
She'll be out in like 2 minutes, probably.
Okay, no problem.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions, just a minute.
Don't sound disappointed. I'm having to work. Get back over it.
Everything I could, not get it.
Exactly, how's the week gone?
No, not really.
Actually, not bad, really, but
Okay.
but
You're bad.
but you can laugh rather than cry.
Exactly.
No, exactly. Was someone speaking when they just...
Yeah, yeah. Normally. Yeah.
No, but someone was speaking from the Security Council. They said they probably would.
What?
You can't be on that side.
Isn't she coming out when they're all done?
They're done.
They are done?
Finished.
Oh,
they're all dead.
Oh, I just thought it was...
Okay, what? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the French.
And they're all done. French ambassador left.
Madam President.
Yeah.
So it's Madam President, they looked up because I mean Mr. President. But
The funniest thing, the Indian ambassador made, like in the Security Council, he read the Belgian speech.
Really? No.
It was the funniest.
I never remember that.
It was the funniest thing I ever seen. He read the Belgian speech.
Really?
Yeah,
I have one sitting on the
in
desk.
European
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for waiting. The United States will be tabling a resolution condemning the sham referenda being held in Ukrainian territory. We know the outcomes of these sham these sham referenda were predetermined in Moscow. The Ukrainian people have already demonstrated they will never accept being subjugated to Russian rule. This Council and the international community must do the same. So we are putting forward a resolution with Albania that condemns the sham referenda, calls on all states to not recognize any altered status of Ukraine, and obligates Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine immediately. We're doing this because, as President Biden said last week, if nations can pursue their imperial ambitions without consequences, then we put at risk everything that this institution stands for, everything. Now we know how one country will feel about this resolution, but we're hoping to see the rest of the Council stand strong in refusing to accept the redrawing of borders through the use of force by any country. And let me be clear, if Russia uses its veto to shield itself from accountability, we will then look to the UN General Assembly to send an unmistakable message to Moscow. The world must stand together and defend the Charter of the United Nations. As Secretary Blinken said last week in the Council, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. And we have seen, as we have seen, the Russian people do not want to fight. People are fleeing Russia's borders, avoiding conscription however they can. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian people are fighting bravely. They refuse to let this war be the end of their beloved country. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. James.
James Bays, Al Jazeera. First, Ambassador, before I get to my question, how quickly do you think you'll be able to bring this to vote? And then my question, in the Council, Ambassador Nebenzia warned on the referenda that this process could continue. What's your reaction to the fact that they may be wanting to annex even more territory?
Well, it's clear, in answer to that second question, it's very clear that the Russians are capable of doing this again. They did it in 2014, and now they're doing it again. So I have no doubts in my mind that they will attempt to do it, and that's why it's so important that we stand against this immediately, and that we will do. Our plan is to take a vote to the resolution to the General Assembly, if not late this week, early next week.
Thanks so much, Ambassador, and thanks, Nate. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. President Zelensky, to the Council, said he'd like security guarantees and more aid so that this kind of move doesn't continue. What's your reaction to that?
We have been clear, the President was clear, that we will support Ukraine, that we will support Ukraine's right to defend itself. And that has been made clear in the support we've provided Ukraine to date, and we will continue to provide them support as long as they need that support to defend their sovereignty.
And security guarantees?
The security guarantees clearly is an issue that we are also discussing as well, but I don't have anything specific on that.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
James, on your question.
Yeah.
Security.
Yeah, Security Council, sorry. Thank you, James.
All right, thanks everyone. We'll
Thanks.